In September of 1957, Louis Armstrong was 55 years old and had been performing for the United States government as a cultural ambassador for several years. The State Department's jazz diplomacy program had sent him abroad twice in previous years, and the tours had been considered by the program's designers and by the diplomatic community that assessed their effectiveness among the most successful cultural exchanges in the program's history. Armstrong was, by any reasonable measure, the ideal candidate for the role. Internationally beloved, accessible, warmly received across cultural and linguistic boundaries, possessed of the specific quality of American music that Cold War diplomacy was attempting to deploy. He was scheduled to go again in the fall of 1957. The destination was the Soviet Union, a tour that those inside the State Department's cultural diplomacy operation regarded as among the most strategically significant possibilities in the program, given the specific dynamics of the Cold War moment and the particular role that jazz was understood to play in communicating something about American life that formal diplomacy could not communicate as effectively. Armstrong was the man they were counting on. He had said he would go. The planning was underway. The photographs from Little Rock, Arkansas, arrived in September. They were photographs of black children attempting to enter Central High School, attempting to exercise the right that the Supreme Court had established 3 years earlier in Brown versus Board of Education, the right to attend a desegregated school. The photographs showed what happened when they tried. The National Guard, posted by Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, turning them away. White mobs on the street outside the school. The specific, visible violence of an American city refusing to implement a court-ordered legal right, and doing so with the explicit support of the state government. President Eisenhower, who had the power to respond by sending federal troops to enforce the court order, had declined to do so. He had expressed, in his public statements about the situation, a kind of procedural hesitance, a reluctance to use federal force in a state matter, a preference for a negotiated resolution, a quality of caution that those who were watching the events in Little Rock understood as the difference between a president who believed the court order should be enforced and one who regarded its enforcement as a political calculation to be weighed against other political calculations. Armstrong was in Grand Forks, North Dakota, when the photographs and the news about Eisenhower's response reached him. He was between performances. He saw what was happening in Little Rock, and he saw the president's response to what was happening in Little Rock, and something that had been contained in Armstrong's public self with the specific discipline of someone who had spent 30 years understanding that the containment served purposes that the expression might undermine. That containment reached its limit. He called the State Department. He canceled the Soviet Union tour. And then he said something to a journalist named Larry Lubenow that nobody who had been following his public career had heard him say before. The response to Armstrong's statement divided along the lines that such responses in 1957 were likely to divide along. Some quarters of white America received it as an outrage, as the ingratitude of an entertainer who had been celebrated and compensated by a country whose racial arrangements he was now publicly criticizing, as the entry of a jazz musician into a political domain where his views were neither relevant nor welcome. The response from the State Department was contained and official. The tour cancellation was acknowledged. The statement was noted. The relationship between Armstrong's capacity as a cultural ambassador and his expression of personal political views was framed in terms that separated the two categories and suggested that they need not be in conflict. The suggestion was not convincing to those who understood that the State Department's use of Armstrong as a cultural ambassador was precisely a political act. that the whole point of sending him abroad was the specific message his presence sent about America, and that the message his statement sent about America was not the one the State Department was paying for. Eisenhower, interestingly, did send troops to Little Rock. 2 weeks after Armstrong's statement, facing international embarrassment and domestic political pressure from multiple directions, the President ordered the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to enforce the court order. Whether Armstrong's specific statement was among the factors that contributed to the decision is not something the historical record establishes clearly. What is established is the sequence. Armstrong spoke in late September. The troops were sent before the end of the month. Armstrong did not claim credit for the timing. He noted the action. He noted that it had taken this long and this much public pressure to produce what the law had been requiring for 3 years. He continued performing. He continued touring. He eventually returned to the State Department's Cultural Ambassador program in subsequent years, a return that has itself been the subject of analysis, with those who find the return a contradiction and those who understand it as a decision consistent with the specific character of the man who made it, a man who had said what he had to say, who had used the specific leverage available to him at the specific moment when it was required, and who then returned to the work because the work was what he was, and canceling it permanently would have been a gesture rather than a strategy. The musicians and writers and other Black Americans who had followed Armstrong's public career with the particular attention of people who understood both his significance and the complexity of his position found in the 1957 statement a confirmation of something they had been waiting to see confirmed, not because they had doubted it, but because the public record had not previously contained it, and the public record was what the public acted on. Now the public record contained it. The smiling man had said something direct and unsparing about the President of the United States. He had used the leverage that the invitation to serve as cultural ambassador gave him, the leverage of being the face the State Department had chosen for the work they wanted done, to make a statement about what America was doing to its own Black citizens that the State Department could not ignore. He had done this calmly, directly, without theatrical preparation. He had said what he meant, and then he had waited to see what happened. What Armstrong said to Larry Lubenow was direct. He said the government could go to hell. He said that Eisenhower had no guts. He said that the way Black people in America were being treated, specifically the way the students in Little Rock were being treated, and specifically the President's decision not to use the authority of his office to protect their right to attend the school, was something he would not represent or implicitly endorse by traveling abroad as an American cultural ambassador while it was happening. He said that what was happening in the streets of Little Rock was a shame and a disgrace. He used the specific words of a man who had been thinking about this for longer than anyone had given him credit for. The statement was covered by the press, not the jazz press, the general press, the wire services, and the newspapers that tracked public statements by public figures for whom Louis Armstrong's political views had not previously been a category of interest. The statement was news because it was unexpected, and it was unexpected because the public image of Louis Armstrong, the smiling, warm, accessible entertainer who directed his warmth outward at every audience, and who had been, by the standard of public Black performers in mid-century America, unusually free from the kind of public political statement that attracted controversy, had given no clear preparation for what he said in Grand Forks. The jazz world, which had spent the preceding decade allowing the bebop generation's characterization of Armstrong as an accommodating entertainer to go largely unchallenged in public discussion, had to account for what he had said. The accounting was not uniform. Some people who had accepted the characterization found it difficult to revise it quickly enough, found themselves in the position of having to acknowledge that the man they had described as someone who had traded his political identity for commercial acceptance had just produced one of the most direct public political statements by any American entertainer about the specific situation in Little Rock. Others found it less surprising than the press did. The people who had known Armstrong in private, who had spent time with him outside the performance contexts, where the warm public self was the expected and produced thing, understood that what he had said was not the discovery of a new political voice, but the expression, finally, of something he had been carrying for decades. The question had not been whether the political consciousness was there. The question had been, what would have to happen for it to become a public statement rather than a private one? Little Rock was the answer. The specific combination of the visible injustice, children being turned away from school, on camera, in front of the country, and the president's specific failure to respond to it with the authority the situation required, had produced in Armstrong the judgment that this was the moment. Not because the situation was categorically different from the injustices he had been navigating his entire life, because the visibility was different, because the president's specific choice was documented and specific and unambiguous, because the State Department's invitation to serve as America's cultural face abroad at this specific moment was a collision between who they wanted him to appear to be and what he had just watched happen. He could not hold both of those things simultaneously. He chose. What the 1957 statement revealed about Louis Armstrong, the thing it placed in the public record that had not been there before, was something that those who had accepted the bebop critique's characterization of him as an accommodating entertainer had to account for. He had said something direct, at a specific political moment, using the specific leverage available to him, in a way that produced a public statement about American racial injustice that was clearer and more specific and more politically consequential than most of what the bebop generation's public political posture had produced. He did not make this point himself. He was not interested in the generational argument about who had been more politically conscious or more politically effective. He had said what he had to say about Little Rock. The argument could take care of itself. What the statement also revealed was something about the specific character of Armstrong's political consciousness, the way it operated, the forms it took, the relationship between what he carried privately and what he expressed publicly. For 30 years, he had carried a clear and strong understanding of what the structure of American racial life was and what it required of the people living inside it. He had expressed this understanding in his music, in the private conversations of people who knew him, in the occasional compressed and carefully chosen public reference to the landscape he was navigating. He had not expressed it in the sustained and visible way that would have produced a public record of political engagement. This was a choice. It was the choice of a man who understood, with a precision that those who criticized it sometimes did not credit, that the commercial platform that the public warmth had built was itself a form of leverage, that being Louis Armstrong to the audiences who loved him was itself a position from which things could be done that could not be done from outside that position. The decision to use that position for a political statement was a decision he made when the moment required it, and not before. When the moment required it, he was ready, because he had always known what he thought. The readiness was not something he had to find. It was something he had been keeping, in the same way he had been keeping everything about his private self, carefully, quietly, available for the moment when its use was required. The 30 years of warmth and the statement about Eisenhower were not contradictions. They were the same person, operating in different circumstances, with the same precise understanding of what the situation required. The warmth had built the platform. The statement had used it. Both of them were Louis Armstrong. Both of them were real. The public that received the statement in September 1957 encountered for the first time the version of Louis Armstrong that had been present all along. The version that the public warmth had contained rather than concealed, that had been operating in private while the public self was doing what the public required, and that arrived, when the moment called for it, fully formed and entirely clear about what it wanted to say. Louis Armstrong canceled a government tour and said something about the president that nobody expected him to say. Eisenhower sent the troops 2 weeks later. Armstrong went back to performing. He did not explain himself beyond what he had already said. He did not need to. The statement was there. The music was there. And anyone who was paying attention to both of them at the same time understood that they had always come from the same place, from the same man, carrying the same clear knowledge of what America was, and choosing, in each specific moment, the form that the knowledge should take.